Today's video explores a purely hypothetical scenario. After World War I, there really was a low probability of war between the US and the UK, and the creation of War Plan Red, which we will soon explore, was done purely to keep America's generals and military planners occupied. Still, both nations commanded a huge empire and were generally considered the two most powerful states on Earth. A confrontation between the two is obviously a popular concept. So, let's explore how both sides planned for such a conflict and which of the two might come out on top. Now we need to start with an important qualification. Both sides need to start the war with good morale, willing to fight. If only the US public considers it a worthwhile war while the British don't, the war will be over fast. And the same goes the other way. Both the US and the UK leaders and population must be convinced that fighting and winning this war is important. A simple story to construct a motive for war might come during the Great Depression. Britain had won the First World War against Germany, but this wasn't cheap. Britain had subsidized most of their allies during the war, and to do this had put itself in great debt to, among others, American companies and institutions. Even more insultingly, when the war was over, both Italy and France managed to negotiate a reduction of their debt towards America, but Britain was refused a similar deal. In 1929, this became even worse, with the American stock market crash and a subsequent Great Depression. Let's use this to start a conflict. Britain periodically halts payments to the US to balance their budget, and an economic war breaks out between the two superpowers, with tariffs, protectionism, accusations of smuggling, and working to undercut the other. This climate of distrust leads to a war around 1933. So let's start with a general look at power levels between the empires, which doesn't look good for Britain. First, Britain was technically in a lot of debt, but at least much of it was to the US, which obviously isn't getting paid now. In all other metrics though, the UK still struggles. Even when counting the entire British Empire against the US has 3 times the industry, and produced 4 times the iron and steel. Military spending was about equal, but the US was far more capable of increasing it. The only advantage that Britain has was a slight naval edge at the start of the conflict, but ever since World War I, the American Navy has been creeping closer and closer to the UK's power level. This leaves a very simple reality. Britain wins fast, or Britain doesn't win. With that, let's evaluate the two war plans. With first, War Plan Red. Red being the code name for the British. The British Dominions each had their own color code too, while the US called themselves Blue. Beyond those, a bunch more war plans were drafted, just in case. Now War Plan Red was actually quite basic. The US would identify that the key to the defense of Canada was the port city of Halifax in Nova Scotia. This city was key for being a major port for the Royal Navy, crucial for supplies and reinforcement from the Empire, and importantly, it was the only telegraph connection between Britain and the Dominion of Canada. Safe to say, capturing the city would be the US priority at the start of the war. Should they fail to take the city fully, merely cutting it off from the rest of Canada would suffice for now. Interestingly, war planning called for an immediate chemical attack on the city, but I consider the US actually starting the war with a violation of the Geneva Convention to be rather unlikely. But as Halifax was captured, or at least cut off, other American attacks would start the invasion of central Canada, which should eventually capture the major cities and consolidate the east. The final avenue of attack was from the west, capturing Vancouver as soon as possible to prevent any strange British actions from the Pacific. Success in these offensives leaves Canada crippled and impossible to be reinforced, which will eventually lead to a full occupation. Now interestingly, war planning called for calm on the side of America after this. No other offensives were planned, and a policy of caution was to be instated against the Royal Navy. The US Navy was to focus on home defense and on securing trade routes. The idea was to wait for the Royal Navy to make a mistake and be destroyed, or just for Britain to lose interest, as even if Britain were to take full naval supremacy, regaining Canada seems an impossibility for them. Also interesting, and by no means does this necessarily have the consent of the political class, but the military planned to prepare Canadian territory for full integration into the US, and the plan explicitly called to never, under any circumstance, return Canada back to Britain. Oh, and by this time, Canada was a functionally independent state and could have technically declared their neutrality. This wouldn't have mattered, because even in this case, the US military planned to invade anyways. Alright, so let's now look at the British strategy. They had correctly identified that Canada was doomed. Even if they had the time to reinforce Canada before it fell, this would put the UK in a direct land war with the US, a nation with a larger core population and the home advantage. At the end of the day, Canada really was not that important to the British Empire. Aside from Canada though, Britain's plan was far more aggressive. From the small base of Bermuda, which I will enlarge for visual convenience, the Royal Navy would seek a swift and decisive confrontation with the US Navy to knock it out. Britain was very aware that losing the naval war here, especially if Bermuda falls, would mean they'd fight a defensive war, with America disrupting imperial shipping, surely forcing a British surrender in due time. To win more time, British colonial forces would strike the Philippines and America's Pacific holdings, both of which American planning called to ignore and not reinforce. British hopes were that such fast and decisive action would make the US give up on the war, as it becomes unpopular and too costly. Interestingly, until 1928, Canada also had their own plan for the war, where they instead would rush into the US, hopefully keeping them distracted until British reinforcement arrived. Though, we know that this plan would be futile, as Britain had no intention to save Canada. So, with the plans now in place and discussed, let's dive into the scenario. Before we do though, most of you aren't subscribed. To keep up to date with all the latest releases, consider doing so. Thank you. As the war begins in 1933, we see the plans come into play. I expect the relatively inexperienced American land army to underestimate the resistance that Canada's army and population can throw up, and I have my doubts about sweeping American gains in the first month. Still, with the British policy being not to reinforce, it wouldn't take long before the US gains the upper hand. Meanwhile, on the seas, Britain starts harassing American shipping, attempting to bait for a big naval battle, but America keeps their fleets hidden and dispersed. For the first year, Britain has the naval edge, but they grow increasingly frustrated, as a full blockade of the US is impossible due to the size of their coasts and navy. This switches the focus of the war to Asia, where Britain does start making advancements, but I think another thing is rather likely. Japan and Britain had long been allies in the past, and while the alliance faded after World War I, partially due to American pressure, I think it is likely that Britain attempts to get Japan into their side of the conflict. To make this happen, Britain could possibly recognize existing Japanese control in China, as well as generally accept Japanese interest over the region. Furthermore, gains could be promised in the Philippines and in the Pacific in general. It is not guaranteed, but Japan joining the war against the Americans is, in my opinion, quite likely. So likely in fact, that this too was something the Americans had prepared for. American War Plan Red Orange dealt with exactly this. The plan would be to be on the defensive on one of the fronts, almost certainly the Pacific one, while going on the offensive on the other. The idea being to knock out one enemy at a time. So in Asia, American positions are swiftly rolled up, and most of the Pacific would start to meet the same fate. From here, the war stalls for a couple of years, except any meaningful Canadian resistance has by now been wiped out. But 1936 is also an election year, and the US president will seek a big victory to cement re-election. Across the past few years, US shipbuilding has gone through the roof, by themselves far eclipsing Japanese and British production. Of course, both British and Japanese production could still be better than in our timeline with the lack of a larger war, but the sheer industrial overmight would still give an easy edge to the US. So I imagine that in 1936, the US gathers all ships they can muster on the eastern coastline, and from this point, it is the UK that is trying to avoid direct confrontation, as their Caribbean holdings are put under threat, and America puts their attention to Bermuda, placing it under blockade and then siege, and once it falls, British power in the Americas is basically destroyed. The worst case has happened. Britain is on the defensive, and America can start raiding British trading routes. Realistically, I think it is very likely that at this point, Britain surrenders. What is the hope in continuing? Progress on the Pacific was slow, and even an Anglo-Japanese conquest of Hawaii would likely do little to change anything meaningful. Better to surrender now and negotiate a defeat than be dictated to later. With the US now able to state their terms, here are a couple ones that I consider near guaranteed. Resumption of loan payments for World War I debt, with new war compensation added onto the total as well. These measures would basically bankrupt the British state. Over in North America, Bermuda would become an American base, greatly weakening British power over North America in the future. Then there is Canada, where I see two options for the nation. Option 1, they become a US allied Republican state. Option 2, direct annexation into the US. First as territories, but plans for quick integration into states. Oh yeah, and Newfoundland would also definitely be seized, while a significant chance exists for American expansion into the British Caribbean as well. The peace has completely broke the British Empire, unlikely to ever recover, bankrupt and weak, most certainly unable to respond to future threats that might arise. But let's first quickly discuss what might happen if Britain still refuses to surrender, betting on a hope that the US doesn't commit to such a far-away aggressive operation, hopefully allowing Britain to stall to get a better deal. Britain's new strategy is purely defensive, likely pressuring Portugal into using the Azores as a naval base, as Britain sets up a new naval corridor against the US. In this process of securing home defense, Britain is relatively likely to invade Ireland, fearful of their good relations with the Americans, as well as America using it as a naval base in the future. But with such actions, Britain's international standing is on a quick decline. They have allied themselves to a Japan that is cannibalizing China. They have invaded neutral Ireland. In Germany, an ultra-nationalist party has taken over, and it is now on the rise. But France alone is not in a position to take care of it. Germany has no trouble walking all over Eastern Europe, using Britain's invasion of Ireland to further justify their own expansion. Either Germany and Italy just have their way with Europe, or Britain and France offer even more to ensure peace with Germany. Even if Britain surrenders to America by 1936, their new economic situation would make them unable to effectively respond to the rise of Germany. By 1938 to 1939, after about 6 years of war, America decisively takes control over the entire Atlantic Ocean, weakening British naval routes from Asia, and soon the Mediterranean route will be closed by America too, which would be the total death knell for Britain. Even worse, with British weakness showing, the Italians too are cozying up to America. An Italian entry against the Brits would very likely be too much to take. Britain has to accept the inevitable. They have lost. Now the peace deal is largely the same to the previous one discussed. Though, if Britain did indeed invade Ireland, America will likely force Britain to leave Northern Ireland, possibly with Ireland remaining a strong US ally for protection in the future. Over in the Pacific, which we previously ignored, we could see major US expansion as well. Should Japan decide to continue the war without Britain, I don't think that I need to tell you that they stand no chance of their own. The war had major effects on Japan as well. Either they never invaded China, which leads to China being far more unified under the nationalists, or they did invade, at which point the US and Chinese together have defeated the Japanese anyways. It is quite possible that a US-Chinese alliance consolidates most of East Asia. Now in either of these scenarios, while America has never entered London, their victory has destroyed the British Empire. Holding on to India becomes near impossible, which is a huge symbolic loss. The dominions of New Zealand and Australia have little to gain by sticking to Britain, instead drifting closer to the American sphere of influence. If Japan hasn't been completely defeated, they'd have no hope at future expansion, and the Soviets too find great difficulty expanding into Asia. This though leaves Europe, a continent the Americans wouldn't care too much about now. Sure, they have some sympathy for the French Republic, but without their ties to Britain, I highly doubt that America puts boots on the ground to intervene against Germany. A major German, Italo-Soviet reorganization of Eastern Europe seems inevitable. This leaves the conclusion of this scenario the upcoming German-Soviet war. Which of the two will come out on top, without America supporting one of them unconditionally, where Germany doesn't need to defend the Atlantic coast, but also hasn't fully defeated France, risking a second front if the French get their act together. With a Soviet Union more prepared for an invasion, as Stalin doesn't mistakenly think that surely the Germans won't invade before Britain surrenders. With such an array of things we don't know, we can't say either for certain. Though, whichever comes out on top, it undoubtedly leads us into a fascinating but dystopian scenario for Eastern Europe. For now though, this is the end of the video. Thank you all for watching, and consider leaving a like and a comment as well as subscribing. If you've enjoyed the video, click on the video on top to watch another in this series. If you've already seen it, then I'm sure that the bottom video is great too. Once again, thank you all for watching, and goodbye.